It's an interesting question to ask why two people collaborate in a play, because there are very few plays that are written by two people, just like there are very few novels written by two people. Musicals are written by two people or more, because you can divide the duties very easily. One is does a musical score, the other one does a libretto or something like that. That's not the case here. We've known each other for many years. Roald Hoffman is a world-famous chemist, a Nobel laureate. He's a theoretician. I'm an experimentalist. He also is a cultural bigamist, like I. His bigamy is more, I say culturally, is more in poetry and nonfiction, mine in fiction and in playwriting. We didn't write it together in the context of being physically together. I live in San Francisco and London, he lives in Ithaca. So in each case we're several thousand miles apart. So we did it roughly through 3,000 or more emails. We did meet. I spent maybe 5 days in Ithaca once, and he spent once a week or 10 days in London with me, and then once in San Francisco, but virtually a little bit in New York. But we wrote most of it long distance, and therefore we couldn't do it together. And it was sequential. One would write one scene or a couple of scenes, send it to the other, who would then change it, send it back, that would change it. So it would be that way. So whoever writes a scene first has in a way the advantage. It's like a chess player, whoever has the first move. And you already, in part, you respond rather than start de novo. So that was different, and that could be the source of major conflicts, and in my opinion is actually the reason why so few plays are written together now. But I think intellectually it worked very well in this case, because we actually decided to use some accurate historical information and then use it in our plays, and talking about three people. And we divided up. He really studied in detail Lavoisier. I really took over Scheele, and we divided Priestley between the two of us. So therefore it was also more economic to do that. It was a great advantage. And he has a very different perspective. As I said, Roald is a more romantic person, has also a much more romantic view and a softer view of science as he presents it to a general public, which is a very attractive way. I have a much more hard-nosed and critical one, and so that's perhaps less attractive. So at least he mellowed me and I sharpened him in Oxygen, so you have an interesting mixture. We were wise because we are both strong persons. We've always been senior authors in our own field. When you have two senior authors collaborating, who is then the senior? So we realized there can't be one. So we settled a lot of prospective problems ahead of time. It's like people really go into serious marriage, which is not just based on sexual attraction or just some romantic things, but saying that's presumably going to be a long-term proposition. I know you, you know me, you know my faults, I know yours. So let's anticipate what could go wrong. And we drew up an agreement, which really was the equivalent of a prenuptial agreement. We called it that. We didn't use a lawyer. We were sophisticated enough to draw it up ourselves. We signed it both. And the most important one was requiring really marital counseling in the context of any conflicts. And that was a very wise idea. If we couldn't find an agreement, and we would then select a dramaturg of our joint choice, we would send him the two versions without telling him who wrote what. And then he would tell us which one he liked better, and we accepted that. And we had to do it about 3 or 4 times, which is not really very many times, but we did. Each of us really dug in our heels and said, no. It usually was your own literary darling that you want to defend, and of course the secret of successful plays is to learn how to kill your darlings. And I dare say this is the version that you're seeing here is version 14, and a lot of literary blood was shed in the process before we ended up in version number 14.
Apothecary Scheele once invited me out to his shed to show me an experiment he'd done earlier in Uppsala. He was bubbling the newly formed fire air through a kind of water.
It must have been lime water. It turned cloudy, didn't it?
How did you know that?
I've listened to Joseph's lectures on fixed air. The same air we expire. The one we remove by passage through lime water.
Writing about women is the one single theme in all of my fiction and all of my plays, and is both deliberate and inadvertent. Inadvertence perhaps wrong, but almost subconsciously, unconsciously written. Namely, I'm interested in my own teaching. I teach in our feminist studies program, for instance, in what happens to women who are now breaking into male-dominated disciplines, from which they were kept out, if anything, at least culturally, sometimes even legally, you might say. And those women who make it, and there are of course more and more of them who do it into the higher positions, in other words, breaking through that glass ceiling, are strong women. Strong women happen to interest me personally, so I write about people that interest me. Now, fortunately, in this play, which was written jointly with Roald Hoffman, Roald is also very much interested in the role of women. He's more romantic than I am, and it's also almost manifested in this play. I would say the person he would like to date or marry or go out with would be Madame Lavoisier. I think writing about the role of women is, to me, of obvious crucial importance, because, you know, the women's movement was perhaps the greatest social experiment during the last 50 years, and one that is going on and is changing the world, not just in this country, but really throughout the world. So I think it's only realistic to describe it, particularly in the context of science. Science and religion, where there are only two things that were really totally male-dominated and male-created, and are the most, you know, you could say almost phallocentric and certainly, well, let's call it that, patriarchal enterprises, and to see how they are being changed. Because not just a question of women moving into these disciplines, but as they do they in fact just become more like the men whom they are either displacing or, or working with, or are they changing actually the culture? And I'm hoping, although I think that hasn't been proven yet, that they're changing the culture. So instead of producing more testosterone themselves, do they bring some estrogen into that culture? And that is a recurring theme of my novels, which are about scientists, not science fiction, but about, I call it science in fiction, and certainly of my plays. I explain science in fiction almost always by a negative, by saying science in fiction is not science fiction, colon, is it autobiography? And what I really mean by that is that, first of all, to contrast it between science fiction. That is, everything that I describe in science and fiction is either real or at least plausible, whereas none of this has to apply to science fiction. So it's not a question one is better, one is worse. They are really, really quite different genres. So for instance, you could write a wonderful science fiction book about violating the second law of thermodynamics, or about a perpetual motion machine, anything like that. You cannot write science in fiction about that, because the science, for me, because I use the novel and now the theater in part for pedagogic purposes. I know it's very dangerous to admit this, because it's supposed to be theatrical and amusing and so on, and you have to hide it, and I try to hide that. But still, it's very important that what I describe, I want to illustrate both what we are doing and particularly how we're doing it. So I want our scientists' scientific behavior not to be always characterized as a Frankenstein or Strangelove or the nerd, which is usually how scientists come across, but in a very real way. My favorite moment changes from different productions. There's a German production that did the experimental scene, which is so very different in different places. For instance, here it is played most realistically of all of them chemically, because you had the wonderful resource of a professor here, Bassam Shakashiri, who is, you know, the chemical showman in the United States. In Germany, where they didn't have a German Herr Bassam, they used puppets, and did it in puppets, life-size puppets, which the actors manipulated, and of course jazzed it up. It wasn't very realistic, but it was wonderfully dramatic, and people really laughed. So for instance, that is one. To me, perhaps the most moving scene in a way, frequently is one, and I felt very strongly about this, is a scene, a late scene between Lavoisier and his wife, where he's already in jail a couple of weeks or months before being executed, never would see her again, and she writes to him. And they reflect on their life, on the pros and cons. And that is based considerably on documents of letters that were written between the two of them, even though they're not the identical ones, the way it's staged.
So what's the vote? Come on, Astrid, tell us. This isn't Florida.
Well, it could have been worse.
I would like people to leave and ask questions and not expect to get the answers from me, because it would be stupid to assume that I would know them all. Many scientists or other people who consider themselves important think that they also have the answers. I really think it's much more important to raise questions, and that's what I'd like people. I'd like to engage them. I'd like them to stay awake, but at the end, I'd like to have them ask a question: did I learn anything? And say, by God, I did. And then what was that? And then argue with others who saw it, and argue about different conclusions in there. For instance, in Oxygen, we do not make it plain who won the Retro Nobel Prize, even though the play ends with a vote of that committee, because in a way there is no right answer. It turns out that there's 7 possibilities with 3 people, 3 alone, 3 pairs, and all 3 together. And I don't think anyone could say this answer is correct and the other one is, unless you agree what discovery is and what evidence we presented and so on, and we left it purposely ambiguous.